Great, thank you very much. And thank you to Ursula for the invitation to talk today. This is really quite wonderful, and it's nice to hear all the discussion about the infrastructure projects that are being presented, but also ways of critiquing them. So today I am going to be trying to compress a lot of information into quite a short amount of time. So I will be moving pretty swiftly, I think, because it's the only way that I can get the a sense of my argument across. So please do excuse me if I go very quickly. So really what I want to do here is to think about the potentials and possibilities for a kind of critical infrastructural practice. And by doing this, I'm gesturing, of course, to Philip Agra's work and the notion of critical technical practice, but also to the kinds of practices that I think are emergent in the digital humanities and some of the more interesting critical approaches in the digital humanities. And also, I want to connect that to some interesting developments in computer science and artificial intelligence. I plan to do this is to do so through the ideas of explainability and interpretability, and really try to discuss how they might be helpful for a critical infrastructure practice. Now, of course, I am very limited in time. I am going to have to move quite quickly, so I will use explainability as a kind of superset for both explainability and interpretability, and I'll come back to the difference between them shortly. Now, what I'm trying to do here is really not try to do a technical description of explainability, although I will give a high-level view of explainability. But what I want to do really is open up how we could think through these interesting discussions that are going on in terms of explainability and interpretability for the critical humanities, and of course, therefore, to some extent, to perhaps critical infrastructure studies. Now, the wider project that I'm kind of thinking within really is, and this I think speaks to Alan Liu's paper yesterday, is this problematic of how one is able to take a position on a particular appropriateness or inappropriateness of an infrastructure or instance. And what I want to do really is think about how we might radicalize the notion of explainability within the context of the notion of a form of life, particularly located within a computational milieu. Now, what I'm doing here really is suggesting that we could think in terms of a digital form of life as a developing learning process or learning processes, both formally and informally, which include a social right to explanation. And the idea really is that a form of life, and a digital form of life in this context, is an experiential and learning process that becomes richer and more differentiated as a result of critique, leading to a process of change. And that's kind of a fundamental building block on which I want to think about these issues. And so this allows us to deploy this notion of a digital form of life as a moment whereby the instantiation of a critical infrastructure practice allows the ability to, or the capacity or competence to see where infrastructures do not function well and challenge them where their functioning is not good. Now, the idea being, of course, that this can create conditions for transforming the situation into something new, into something potentially progressive, into something different. Now, by forms of life, of course, I am gesturing towards the work of Rahel Yegi and her notion of a non-instrumentalist's notion of problem-solving processes as social practices. And she argues that forms of life are anchored in the world and provide a basis for affirming something like the appropriateness of social practices. A form of life then is rather like Dewey's notion of a way of life, and draws on the work of Edward Spranger's ideal types of individuality. I'd also like to gesture towards the enter-left idea of perhaps the fully human in the kind of Marxist tradition, offering a contribution to this normative moment, or or perhaps the notion of human personality in the non-Marxist left tradition, particularly represented in the work of R.H. Tawney and E.P. Thompson, and of course James just mentioned Polanyi as well, and I'll name check him. But fundamentally and very importantly, of course, we want to keep in mind that this sense of forms of life that I want to develop here are plural, multiple, and overlapping, but nonetheless normative ways of living. So for Yegi, one is socialized into a form of life. It's how people live, what they do, and how they do it. And it is also part of a context in which one lives. It's the, as it were, background to which one refers, not necessarily cognitively or consciously, but it's a basis on which one acts. And fundamentally, of course, why this is useful in terms of a critical infrastructure practice and critical infrastructure studies more generally, I think, is that forms of life have a normative trait. They always involve sequences of action governed by rules and regulations, and therefore a division into what is and is not appropriate. And it's that moment of judgment, I think, that's quite interesting, that we can draw from this notion of forms of life. And so the question then becomes, I suppose, that what forms of life are appropriate to a digital society? What norms should surround our, let's call it, digital twin or digital personality? Or perhaps better, what forms of life does digital technology engender, and what should those forms of life be? And those are much kind of wider questions that, of course, I can't answer today. But certainly in the context of explainability and interpretability, I think what is interesting is that I think as part of the practices of a digital forms of life should be that ability to evaluate and challenge digital infrastructures, to criticize them as appropriate or inappropriate. And I think this means really opening the way for criticism of incomplete or deficient instantiations of infrastructures, and that for example, the digital humanities thereby and critical infrastructure studies can take a stance in relation to forms of life that are not appropriate within particular contexts. And here I'm thinking perhaps one could think in terms of particular functional differentiations or spheres. And again, this comes back to Alan's discussion yesterday about the way in which different value systems or different normative moments might exist within different functional differentiations in society. And so we could think of a deficient infrastructure might in some sense challenge a digital form of life, which creates a situation which thereby becomes problematic, similar, I think, to the way Jonathan was talking about a kind of controversy analysis as a way of stepping into a way of identifying these infrastructures as important to think about. And I think what's interesting about this suggested approach is that a situation then becomes intelligible as a problem, open to discussion and challenge and criticism, and also opening a wider discussion of a life which is worth living, right? Why do we have these infrastructures? What are they for? What are they doing? What are they enabling? What are they disabling? And also, of course, more broadly, I want to be able to defend democratic politics, particularly under the conditions and the challenges of computational capital. One way I do this is connect these digital forms of life to what I'm calling explanatory publics. Haven't got time really to talk about this particularly, but the idea really is that explanatory publics require certain frameworks and certain competencies from the digital forms of life. And really that this connects up to this social right to explanation, requiring answers, as it were, socially to why questions that may be posed to institutions, to infrastructures, and we'll come back to that, and to more generally the political, economic, technical and cultural systems that exist in our societies. So a digital polity thereby must enable, must create the conditions for its citizens to develop a form of life that enables this explanatory thought, I suggest. And of course, these are in addition to other capacities, and thereby to challenge these ideas and practices. Now, of course, an explanation this is a big question, and of course it requires us to think very deeply about this, and we'll talk about some of that as I go through the other slides. But really the idea is that we must be able to open up beyond just the kind of formal logical properties of an explanation and look at the context in which it's offered. So explainability, if you're not familiar with it, is the idea that a technical system must be explainable and thereby defensible. The argument is that systems we've built and are building are becoming too complex for understanding, and in some cases potentially too complex to even explain. Now, of course, these cause issues when they, of course, accused of bias and fairness being unequal. And of course, from the technical side, these critiques can sometimes be difficult to respond to, particularly whereby the algorithms responsible are, in some senses, very complicated, very distributed, networked, or due to systemic integration, almost impossible to understand. And one can think about machine learning systems, particularly in this context. And I think this explains the tendency to blame or to suggest changes to the inputs, the bad data, the biased data, the data contamination, as we might call it, and therefore to check and de-bias, indeed raising its own obvious problems for that approach. And I think it also suggests that the kind of turn more generally towards questions of ethics, and this has been particularly notable in terms of a professional code of ethics. And of course, we are all, I'm sure, very familiar with the problems those issues of ethics have also generated for the tech companies and for people who try to instantiate ethics in particular ways. So explainability then is really trying to capture this notion of an interpretive gap and to close it through essentially a technical solution. So very briefly, an explainable system is a system that incorporates a secondary automated system, and this secondary automated system somehow understands the primary system and generates an explanation of how that system works. And that explanation is, of course, subject to lots of very interesting problematics that we can hopefully get to. And in contrast, an interpretable system, an alternative way of thinking about this problem, is that the system itself should be, in some senses, human readable from the bottom up, should rely on much simpler models, i.e. not these gigantic machine learning models, straightforward calculations and filtering, and thereby perhaps they might be communicated more easily. And the result of either the interpretable or explainable systems is that they create the conditions of contestability. That is, that these results can be understood and challenged. I won't read through the different claims from a contestability, but the idea really is that these are essentially normative in orientation, and they suggest that one can distinguish between good and bad outcomes, between appropriate and inappropriate use of a technology. And I think that's the interesting possibility of a connection there. So this has obviously opened up a very interesting debate around explanation, around this question of explanatory needs from systems, and of course also has connected to wider political, social clashes and questions around certain kinds of uses of technology, certain kinds of algorithms, certain kinds of, shall we call it, algorithmic power. And we might also note that explainability is something gestured towards in the European Union's GDPR as well. So these systems are difficult to understand. Just to give you a quick example, the OpenAI GPT-3 has over 175 billion machine learning parameters. Even beginning to try to explain this systemic process is hard for computer scientists. And in many cases, the computer scientists themselves are a bit unsure what's going on in these systems. They seem to work, but are not necessarily fully understanding why. One other issue of just very briefly going to talk about because time is so tight, but just to say that explainability and the discussions around explainability are not just about normative outcomes. This explains why DARPA, for example, has invested in explainability. This is the famous picture. I haven't really got time to show it you, but you can see in the bottom half of the diagram that notion of a separate explainable system that somehow can provide this nice explanation to the user. So this is the ability to answer these why questions, to create the potentialities for these systems to answer questions, and I think raises a new potential for a new form of life through computational critique, through the application of learning through processes that enable explainability to become part of our social learning experiences. A process, we might say, of enrichment and differentiation, a process of reflexivity and understanding through critique. So what is the kinds of why questions that are addressed here? I list some here. I'm so short on time, I cannot go through them, but I do want to get towards some of the implications for digital humanities. Digital humanities, of course, I'm sure you're very familiar with. I won't even attempt a definition, but what I will say is that DH, of course, has over the past I don't know how many years built many systems, has a high degree of interpretive competence in relation to these systems, has an engagement with publics and the creation and development of public humanities. And I think as it has grown and matured and has to reconcile internal criticism over some of its instrumental approaches, its as it was called, neoliberal tools, these ideas of reflexivity and social and political challenges have been calling, I think, on the digital humanities to do technology differently. And I think that explainability really could be a way of contributing to the potentialities for that. So I'm going to draw to a close now. I am very close to my end point, if not over it. I think what's very interesting about digital humanities is the way in which they could contribute both to thinking about explainability, for deploying explainability and interpretability as critical concepts, but also thinking other computations. And I think this again connects back to critical infrastructure of practice and how critical infrastructure of practice could be part of what digital humanities and the best kinds of digital humanities could be. And I will stop there.